Hi, first graders. We're on Knowledge 4, Lesson 5, People of the Nile. We only have one vocabulary word to go over, and that is flooding. Say flooding. Flooding is a large amount of water covering an area that is usually dry. So today's story is set in a new location. We are now in the country of Egypt, and Egypt is a country on the continent of Africa. And this is a picture of the country of Egypt. So much of Egypt, like Mesopotamia, is made up of a desert. So we are going to be talking about the Sahara Desert, which is located in Egypt. Also, we're going to be learning about an important river in Egypt known as the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the world, and it flows right through Egypt. So at about the same time that people were living in Mesopotamia, people were also living in Egypt. The next several read-alouds are going to be about life in ancient Egypt several thousand years ago. So part of the read aloud is going to be factual information about the Egyptians, and the other part is going to be a made-up story with characters. While people were creating cities and nations in Mesopotamia, another group of people, the Egyptians, were building another great civilization on the banks of another river known as the Nile. The Nile River is the longest and one of the mightiest rivers on earth. After it flows all the way through Egypt, it empties into the sea. The Nile has always given the people of Egypt a special advantage. Most farmers outside of Egypt had a hard time growing crops. They often had to farm the same land year after year. The problem with this was that by using the same land every year, the crops they planted would use up the natural vitamins and minerals in the land. After the vitamins and minerals were used up, the farmers could no longer grow crops on that land. So the farmers would have to stop farming and give the land a few years to rest. By not growing crops on the land for a few years, the natural vitamins and minerals the plants needed to grow would start to build up again. Then the farmers could farm on the land again, at least for a few more years. Because the farmers could only grow their crops on the same land for a few years before the natural vitamins and minerals would be used up, they could not count on being able to grow enough food every single year. It was a very hard life. But the Egyptians could farm the same land over and over again. Do you know why? The reason they could do it has to do with the Nile. The Nile begins its long journey to the sea in the high mountains of Central Africa. Every spring, heavy rainfalls fill Africa's mountain lakes, emptying water into the Nile. Rushing down the mountain slides with enormous speed and power, the swollen river carries mud rich with vitamins and minerals in its current or continuous flow of water. When the floodwaters reach the flatlands of Egypt, they spread out for miles on either side of the riverbanks. When the rains and the flooding stop, the river usually goes back to the same size. Long, long ago, the ancient Egyptians planted crops in the muddy fields that were enriched with vitamins and minerals. In this way, the Nile floods meant life for the Egyptians. But if the rains were light for a year or two, the floodwaters would not bring enough rich soil, and the people might go hungry because they would not be able to grow as much food. The Egyptians knew their lives depended on the river. Most Egyptians lived within 12 or 13 miles of the Nile on one side or the other, for it was there that the floodwaters refreshed the land each and every year. The floodwaters could also be very dangerous. When the spring floods came, the Nile could destroy homes and villages if they were built too close to the river. So many ancient Egyptian villages were built up above the level of the river, so that when the spring floods came, the river would not destroy the buildings or the homes. Some villages, though, were built on the same level as the river itself. Every year, the people living there would have to leave their village when the water rose too high. They moved away to a safer place, and then they would return a few weeks later after the river had returned to a lower level. The ancient Egyptians in those villages would have to repair a lot of the damage. Still, they did that every single year. Some villages had another way of dealing with the floodwaters. The people living in these villages dug canals, which were ditches cut into the earth that spread from the edge of the river to carry away the extra water from the spring floods. The water flowed through the canals, past the village, and into the farm fields beyond. So the village did not get damaged, and the water could be transported out further from the Nile. But the Egyptians used the Nile for another reason, as we shall see in this story of an ancient Egyptian family. Okay, so now we're going to change over to a story with some characters. One day, thousands of years ago, an Egyptian woman named Ippy and her daughter Merit went down the Nile to gather some soft, muddy clay so they could make clay pots. Approaching the river, they heard a voice call out, "Ippy, Merit!" They looked up and smiled, for sailing out in the middle of the Nile was Renzi, the husband of Ippy and the father of Merit. Renzi was a fisherman who sailed his narrow boat up and down the river, casting out rope nets to catch fish. Renzi did this just as the men in his family had always done before him. As Renzi's mother had told him, once a fisherman, always a fisherman, and once a fisherman's son, always a fisherman too. Renzi began making his way back to Merit and Ippy, and after a few minutes he reached shore. Pulling his boat a little way onto the sand so that it would not drift back into the water, he made his way over to them. Merit turned to her father, who hugged and kissed her. "Little fish," he said gently, using one of his nicknames for Merit. The three of them took the rope fishing nets from the boat and hung them to dry on the wooden racks in the sun. Then Renzi, his wife, and his daughter took the fish from the boat back to their village, where they would sell them at the market. That night, exhausted from a day at the market, they made their way back to their little house made of mud bricks at the end of the village. The end. Okay, you may now go ahead and click on the Google form to answer the questions about today's read aloud.